The photograph was supposed to be nothing more than a charming relic, an afternoon in 1901 when the Whitlock family gathered beneath the sprawling oak tree behind their farmhouse, dressed in their best, smiling through the stiff formality of the era. It had been tucked away for more than a century, its edges browned and curling, the faces of the long-gone relatives frozen in a happiness that felt almost rehearsed. When the archivists restored it, the family was delighted, until someone noticed the small figure standing near the far right of the frame. The moment the forgotten child first appeared in the restored 1901 family photograph began not with shock or horror but with a kind of puzzled curiosity that settled over the room like a slow-moving fog. The Whitlock descendants had gathered in the small local museum's archive room, expecting nothing more than a pleasant unveiling of their newly preserved family heirloom. They had been told the photograph was a treasure, a rare, nearly pristine group portrait taken just after the turn of the century, a moment frozen beneath the wide sweep of an old oak tree that once shaded their ancestral home. The image had been faded and brittle when donated, difficult to decipher beyond a collection of smudged silhouettes. But advanced restoration promised to reveal every detail in stunning clarity. What no one expected was that clarity would bring with it a presence none of them could explain. When the archivist lowered the restored photograph onto the table, the group leaned in, smiling at first. They admired the formal arrangements, the stiff postures, the layered clothing typical of the period. The patriarch stood tall at the center, his hand resting proudly on the shoulder of his eldest son. The matriarch sat composed in her high-neck blouse and long skirt, flanked by daughters whose expressions held that peculiar mix of shyness and pride common in early photography. A few of the younger children sat cross-legged at the front, squinting slightly as though the sun had been too bright that day. Everything seemed familiar, consistent with the family's oral history and the stories passed down through generations. But then, gradually, a shift in the room's mood occurred, a slight, almost imperceptible slowing of breath, a shared awareness prickling at the back of every neck. Someone asked, very softly, "Who is that?" The question drifted over the table, pulling every eye back to the right edge of the photograph. There, half in the light and half swallowed by the tree's shadow, stood a child no one had noticed at first glance. He was small, perhaps 6 or 7, though his posture made him seem both younger and impossibly older. His clothing didn't match the others. While the rest of the family wore their finest Sunday garments, this child's attire looked worn and ill-fitted, as though each piece had belonged to someone else long before him. His shirt hung loosely off one shoulder, frayed at the edges, the fabric thin enough to suggest it had endured far more seasons than a child his size should have worn it through. None of this was what unsettled the family most. It was his face. Where every other figure in the photograph displayed the typical blank solemnity of early portraiture, this child's expression was wrong in a way no one could immediately define. His eyes were dark, not merely in color, but in depth, as though something behind them absorbed every trace of light the camera had attempted to capture. His gaze was fixed not on the photographer, but slightly off-angle, directed outward toward the space beyond the image itself. Toward the viewer. Toward the descendant staring back at him across more than a century of time. At first, the Whitlocks exchanged confused glances. Someone suggested it might be a cousin or a neighbor's child accidentally included in the photograph. Someone else proposed that the restoration process had sharpened a previously unnoticed blur, bringing a forgotten figure into focus. But as each person searched their memories of family stories and genealogical charts, a chilling realization settled over them: there was no record, none whatsoever, of an extra child present at that gathering. The Whitlock family had been extensively documented for generations, with names, dates, and relationships preserved meticulously in handwritten ledgers and later in digital archives. Every birth, every death, every marriage had been recorded with almost obsessive precision. Yet this child had no place among them. It was as if he had never existed. The youngest descendant, a teenager who had spent months researching the family tree for a school project, was the first to insist the child wasn't in the original version of the photograph. She remembered examining the faded print in its pre-restoration state and noted that the right edge had been little more than a haze of grey and sepia. The museum archivist retrieved the untouched original from its protective sleeve and laid it beside the restored copy. The group leaned closer. There was indeed something on the far right side of the original, a faint shape, a barely perceptible smudge, but nothing that resembled a child. Certainly nothing with a face. The archivist frowned, adjusting her glasses and studying both images. Restoration algorithms could clarify hidden details, but they could not invent new people. They could not fabricate a human form where none had existed. They could only enhance what was already present. Yet the restored photograph portrayed the child with such clarity and depth that it appeared he had been standing there all along, simply waiting for the chance to step forward out of obscurity. The silence in the room deepened as the family struggled to rationalize the figure's presence. Someone whispered that perhaps the smear in the original had been a child after all, just too obscured by damage to be recognizable. But even that explanation rang hollow. The child's image was too precise, too clean, too intentional. It felt less like an accident of photographic decay and more like a revelation, as though something buried had willingly surfaced. The longer they stared, the more the atmosphere changed. The archivist later described it as a sensation of being watched, not by the child in the photograph, but by something behind the photograph, some presence pressing outward through the paper. One descendant said he felt as though the room had grown colder, though the thermostat on the wall insisted the temperature hadn't changed. Another descendant backed away from the table entirely, murmuring that the child looked familiar in a way she couldn't explain, as though she had seen his face somewhere before, not in family records but in dreams she could no longer fully remember. And all the while, the small, shadowed figure seemed to wait for their recognition, his dark eyes fixed upon them with a stare that felt patient, knowing, and impossibly ancient, as though the restoration had not revealed him but released him, granting him the attention he had been denied for more than a century, drawing the Whitlocks closer to a truth they had never known existed and were now powerless to ignore. The archivist's discovery began quietly, almost innocently, as she returned to her office with the restored and original photographs in hand, determined to study them further after the Whitlock family left. She prided herself on precision, on understanding the limitations of restoration technology, and she knew one thing with absolute certainty: restoration could not and would not create a new figure in a historical image. It could clarify, enhance, repair, or reveal what had been obscured, but it could not conjure something that had never been there. The child's sudden presence, so stark and unmistakable in the enhanced photograph, gnawed at her in a way that went beyond professional curiosity. It felt like a challenge to her expertise. Or perhaps, she later admitted to herself, it felt like a message. She began by examining both versions side by side under the stark white glow of her desk lamp. The original was fragile, its edges brittle, its surface marred by decades of exposure to moisture and dust. The right margin, where the strange child now stood so clearly, was the most damaged area, a blur of indistinct shapes and faded shadows that could have been anything or nothing. But something about the smear had always seemed unremarkable, the kind of deterioration common in photographs from that era. She zoomed into the digital restoration on her screen. The boy's face appeared with unsettling precision, pale skin contrasted against the dark hollows of his eyes, hair unkempt as though he had stepped out of a windy field instead of a family gathering, his mouth fixed in that faint, ambiguous expression that was neither smile nor frown. The archivist felt the slightest prickle along her arms, a sensation she brushed off as the chill of the overactive air conditioning. Still, she could not shake the awareness that the child's presence felt too defined, too unmistakably intentional. Restoration software didn't invent emotional nuance. It didn't create expressions. She opened earlier drafts of the restoration process, checking each automated layer. Normally, she could trace how a figure emerged, shadows sharpened, faded outlines corrected, details reconstructed from surviving patterns. But in this case, the child's form did not appear gradually. He emerged fully, unmistakably, between two stages where no such clarity should have existed. It was as if he had stepped forward in a split second between one adjustment and the next. Unease tightened in her chest, but she pressed on, driven by a need to justify or disprove what her instincts whispered. She went to the storage room, rummaging through the museum's collection for other Whitlock photographs from around the same period. There were several portraits, gatherings, candid scenes captured by traveling photographers, and she studied each one carefully. If this boy had been real, if he had belonged to the family in any capacity, he should have appeared somewhere else. But he didn't. In photo after photo, the Whitlocks appeared exactly as recorded, every child accounted for, every adult recognizable. There was no sign of the boy with the hollow eyes. No shadowed figure lurking behind the others. No anomaly at all. She catalogued her findings with increasing agitation, as though documenting the absence of the child only solidified the wrongness of his sudden appearance. At one point, she paused and rubbed at her temples, wondering if fatigue was coloring her perception. Maybe the child's clarity in the restored photo was simply an artifact of digital reconstruction, an exaggerated interpretation of a smudge. Determined to test that theory, she pulled out older restorations of other badly damaged photos. None of them displayed anything remotely similar. Imperfections didn't become people. Blurs didn't grow faces. Shadows didn't acquire eyes. Her rational explanations were crumbling, leaving behind a hollow dread she refused to articulate. She pulled the original Whitlock photograph closer. Under a magnifying lens, the damaged right edge remained a vague haze, nothing that could justify the detailed figure in the restored version. Yet something tugged at her attention. The smudge, under magnification, seemed subtly different from the rest of the deterioration. Most damage displayed irregular patterns, but this shape had a softness to it, a faint curve, almost like the outline of a shoulder. And beneath that, she squinted, what looked like the faint suggestion of a cheek. It was too vague to rely on, yet too deliberate to ignore. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but the shape pulled at her, as though the photograph itself wanted to show her something she wasn't ready to see. Late into the evening, she ran the restoration software again, this time entirely from scratch. She watched every stage closely, ready to stop the process the moment anything unusual occurred. The program cleaned dust specks, adjusted contrast, reconstructed torn fibers, and clarified faded sections. Everything behaved exactly as expected until the final rendering pass. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, breath held. The blurred shape on the right deepened. Contrast sharpened. Lines formed. A silhouette took shape. And then, in an instant, the child appeared, fully defined, exactly as before, his eyes seemingly locking onto hers through the screen. She recoiled, bumping into her chair, her breath catching with a sharp gasp she couldn't suppress. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she forced herself to regain composure. She convinced herself she had simply been startled by the speed of the rendering, the abruptness of the image's final clarity. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the speed that had unnerved her. It was the sensation, fleeting but real, that the child had looked at her before the software finished forming his face. As if he had been waiting. As if he had recognized her. She shut down the program, but the child's image lingered behind her eyelids every time she blinked. A strange, oppressive feeling settled in the room, thick and heavy, as though the air had gained weight. She checked the restored version one final time, hoping, perhaps even praying, that she would find an error, an explanation, something mundane that would anchor her back to the rational world she trusted. But the child remained exactly as he had appeared earlier, unchanged, unaltered, unsettlingly present, standing among a family that had never mentioned him, never recorded him, never acknowledged him in any known history, yet now captured with such clarity it felt less like a discovery and more like a return, as though the restoration process had not uncovered him but allowed him to come forward, carefully, deliberately, and with purpose. When the Whitlock descendants were asked about the mysterious child, the reactions were immediate and deeply varied, yet all carried the same undercurrent of unease. Some laughed nervously and dismissed the figure as a mistake or an illusion created by the restoration process, but their voices lacked conviction. Others grew quiet, their expression subtly shifting as if the photograph had stirred something buried deep within them, something they had never fully understood or dared to examine. The archivist, still rattled from her earlier discoveries, gathered the family together again not to alarm them but to verify what she already suspected: none of them had ever heard of this child before. But what unfolded in that meeting was far stranger than simple denial. It began with the eldest descendant, Margaret Whitlock, an 82-year-old woman with a sharp memory and an even sharper tongue. She had been the keeper of the family's history for decades, responsible for cataloguing letters, diaries, and documents passed down for generations. When she saw the restored photograph, her brow furrowed as she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing at the boy lingering at the edge of the frame. She whispered that she had never seen him before, never heard his name, never encountered a single reference to an extra child from that era. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear but with a kind of frustrated certainty that something was wrong, something that should not have been possible. Yet as the archivist pressed gently for details, Margaret paused, as if realizing something she hadn't thought about in years. She began recounting stories her grandfather used to tell her, stories she had always dismissed as old man ramblings whispered late at night by firelight. He had spoken of a strange presence around the Whitlock farmhouse, a small figure seen darting past windows or standing beneath the big oak tree at dusk. He claimed that on certain nights, when the wind howled through the branches, the youngest children would wake crying because they felt someone staring at them from the corner of their room. Margaret had never taken these tales seriously, assuming they were nothing more than the eerie embellishments of a man who enjoyed frightening children. But now, looking at the photograph, she admitted that the figure bore an uncanny resemblance to the description she thought she had long forgotten. Another family member, Daniel, spoke reluctantly when asked whether he had ever heard anything unusual. He remembered his grandmother, Margaret's aunt, refusing to talk about her childhood in the farmhouse. Whenever someone asked her what life had been like back then, she always changed the subject abruptly, her voice tight, her hands trembling as though the memories caused her real discomfort. Daniel recalled one instance when he had pressed her for details, only to have her reply with a single cryptic sentence, "Some things are better left unremembered." At the time, he had assumed she meant the hardships of that era, the losses that were common in families of the early 1900s. But now he wondered if her silence had been an attempt to bury something darker. The archivist listened to these scattered recollections with growing dread. None of the stories directly mentioned a lost sibling or an unrecorded child, but each carried a strange common thread, a denial shaped not by ignorance but by deliberate avoidance, as though older family members had known something but chosen never to speak of it. It became clear that the absence of information was not accidental. It was purposeful, a silence passed down through generations like a hidden burden. When pressed further, more descendants came forward with vague memories of their own. One recalled that her father used to say he hated looking at old photos of the farmhouse because sometimes there were too many people in them. Another remembered finding her great-grandmother crying quietly over a photograph, whispering that she wished he would finally rest. But when asked who he was, her great-grandmother refused to answer. These testimonies were unsettling not just because of their content but because of their consistency. None of the family members had ever discussed these odd childhood recollections with each other, yet their stories formed a pattern, an atmosphere of long-standing tension surrounding the family's past, a sense that something had been wrong at the old farmhouse long before any of them were born. The archivist began piecing together a troubling possibility. The reason there was no record of the child was not because he had never existed, but because someone had intentionally erased him from history. The idea seemed absurd, yet the more the family spoke, the more the archivist sensed a collective fear lingering beneath their words, a fear passed from grandparents to parents to children without ever being named. She noticed how some descendants refused to look at the restored photograph, glancing away as though the boy's eyes were too unsettling to meet. Others stared at it with a strange mixture of recognition and denial, their brows creased as if trying to recall a dream that evaporated the moment they reached for it. The archivist asked if any family journals mentioned unusual behavior or unexplained events around 1901, the year the photograph was taken. Margaret hesitated before admitting that one diary from that period, the matriarch's, contained several pages that had been carefully removed. She had always assumed they were torn out accidentally or damaged by time, but now, looking back, she wondered why only that diary suffered such specific loss. Another descendant recalled hearing that a small grave had once existed on the property, unmarked and long since overgrown, though no one had ever identified who had been buried there. As the family continued to share their fragmented stories, the archivist realized they were describing a kind of collective forgetting, a memory hole so deep it had swallowed an entire child's existence. And yet, the fear in their voices suggested that even if they could not name him, some part of their lineage had never fully escaped him. The photograph's restoration seemed less like a revelation of lost history and more like the return of something deliberately kept at bay. The idea settled heavily over the room. The child had not been forgotten by accident. He had been erased. But erasures are rarely perfect, and the fragments that remained, whispers, nightmares, unexplained silences, had lingered in the family's psyche for generations. Now, with the restored photograph exposing his presence unmistakably, it felt as though the child was stepping out of the shadows not just to be seen, but to be remembered, as though he had been waiting for the moment when the family could no longer deny him, when the past they had buried would rise again to demand acknowledgement, no matter how deeply they had tried to forget him. The moment the archivist brought the restored photograph back into the room for closer examination, the atmosphere shifted as if the space itself tightened. The Whitlock descendants gathered around reluctantly, each of them carrying the weight of the unsettling testimonies they had already shared. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but each felt an inexplicable pull toward the image, a mixture of dread and fascination that made it impossible to look away for long. When the archivist zoomed in on the child's face, there was almost a collective intake of breath, like the group was bracing for something they couldn't name yet somehow anticipated. It was then that the most disturbing detail emerged, not through the technological precision of the restored image, but through the strange, shifting quality the figure seemed to possess the longer anyone stared at him. At first glance, the child's expression seemed unchanged from before, solemn, hollow-eyed, slightly distant from the rest of the family. But the archivist noticed something subtle, something she couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't just that his gaze appeared intense, it was that it seemed different from earlier in the day. She blinked, leaned closer, and adjusted the magnification. The child's eyes, once angled slightly toward the camera's direction, now seemed to tilt in a way that suggested he was no longer looking past the lens, but directly at her. She checked the saved files, comparing earlier scans to the current one, her heart beating faster with each passing second. The angle of the gaze had changed. Ever so slightly, but undeniably. She didn't say anything at first. Maybe she was mistaken, she thought. Maybe it was a trick of light, of shadows, or of the mind trying to make sense of something already unsettling. But as she zoomed in further, small expressions that had once seemed fixed now appeared to shift. The faint line beneath his left eye deepened just slightly, lending the face a more exhausted look. The corner of his mouth, once neutral, now tilted in what could only be interpreted as the beginning of a different expression, something between a smirk and a grimace, something that suggested intention rather than coincidence. Margaret Whitlock noticed the archivist's hesitation and leaned in as well. Her breath caught in her throat. She remembered the child's face from earlier that morning, and she remembered feeling unnerved by his stare. But now, the stare wasn't merely unnerving. It was directed. Focused. Intentional. She whispered to the others to look, her voice barely audible. When they gathered around and stared long enough, each person reacted in the same way, confusion first, then denial, then a creeping dread that slithered up the spine and settled heavily between the shoulders. Some of them insisted they were imagining it. Others stepped back, unable to keep their eyes on the photo for more than a few seconds. The archivist, though shaken, continued to examine the image. She attempted to rationalize the shift by pulling up earlier versions on her computer. But when she placed them side by side on the screen, the differences became even more glaring. The gaze was not identical. The angles were not the same. The details of the expression, subtle lines, shadows, soft curves, had changed in ways that no preservation process could justify. These were modifications that suggested movement, or at the very least, evolution. It was as though the child in the photograph was not merely an image but a presence adjusting itself in response to the attention it received. This realization gnawed at everyone as they continued to inspect the photograph from different distances. One descendant, a man in his 40s, swore the boy's pupils seemed larger than they had been before. Another insisted that the child's head was tilted slightly differently, that he hadn't leaned that way in the first restored version. A third claimed the shadows around the boy had deepened, making him appear less like part of the scene and more like something emerging from behind it. No two people agreed on exactly what had shifted, but all of them agreed something had. The archivist found herself unwilling to turn her back on the photo, feeling irrationally as though the child's eyes would follow her if she moved. At one point, she left the room briefly to retrieve additional equipment, but when she returned, the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the absence of human eyes on the photograph had allowed it to settle into a new, even more disturbing arrangement. She approached it slowly, her pulse thudding in her ears. The child's faint, ambiguous expression now struck her as unmistakably aware. The look he gave seemed sharper, more knowing, as though the photograph had crossed an unseen threshold in her absence. More unsettling still was the consistency of the effect. No matter how many times she reset the display, recalibrated the screen, or switched between digital copies, the changes were always present. The photograph seemed determined to evolve, inch by inch, subtle enough to create doubt but clear enough to create fear. The archivist tried brushing it off as a psychological phenomenon, perhaps the mind trying to impose motion or life on an inanimate image. But deep inside, she felt something colder than logic whispering otherwise. As the family's discomfort grew, some stepped away entirely, refusing to look at the photograph again. But those who remained felt something deeper than fear taking shape, a sense that the child was responding to them. Watching them. Recognizing the attention he was receiving and returning it in kind. His shifting gaze felt almost like an attempt to connect, an effort to reach across time and paper and ink to reclaim the memory that had been denied him. The more the family stared, the stronger the impression grew that the child wasn't trying to frighten them but to make himself known, to ensure he could no longer be dismissed, overlooked, or erased. And yet, there was something undeniably unsettling in the way he did it. Something that tightened the air, that dulled the light in the room, that made everyone feel as if they were standing not before a photograph but before someone who had been waiting for this moment for far too long, watching them with a gaze that grew clearer, sharper, and more restless each time their eyes met his. At the discovery of the hidden journal felt like the final thread in a tapestry that had been quietly weaving itself around the Whitlock family, pulling tighter with every revelation. Every strange shift in the photograph, every memory that surfaced from the shadows of their lineage. It was Margaret who found it, though she insisted later that she had no idea what had compelled her to search the old storage chest in her attic that night. The chest had belonged to her grandfather, a man known for his meticulous record-keeping, and yet she had never thought to examine it closely because she believed every meaningful document had already been archived. But something about the event of the day gnawed at her, something about the nameless child whose stare seemed to move with their own. She said she felt drawn upstairs as though the air itself guided her to the chest and urged her to open it. The journal was thin, its leather cover cracked, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was tucked beneath old handkerchiefs and a rusted pocket watch that hadn't ticked in decades. There was no name written on the cover, no date, no title to suggest its importance. But when Margaret opened it and saw the handwriting within, familiar loops and sharp angles she recognized instantly as her great-grandmother's, she felt her stomach drop. Her great-grandmother had been the matriarch in the 1901 photograph, the same woman whose diary from that year was mysteriously missing several pages. And now, it seemed, those pages had simply been relocated, hidden away in this forgotten journal as though someone had wanted them separated from the rest. Perhaps intentionally. Perhaps desperately. Margaret spent hours reading through the entries, each one more unsettling than the last. The early pages spoke of family life, of chores, of illnesses, of the weather, nothing unusual for the time. But then, abruptly, the tone changed. Her great-grandmother wrote of sleepless nights, of whispers that drifted through the house when everyone else was in bed, of waking with the sense that someone small was standing beside her, watching, though her children were all accounted for in their rooms. She described hearing footsteps in the hallway that stopped just outside her door, footsteps too light to belong to an adult but too measured to belong to a child who was awake past bedtime. She wrote of feeling the weight of something sitting at the foot of her bed, though the room remained empty whenever she lit a candle. Her words carried the trembling cadence of a woman who feared she was losing her mind but was even more afraid that she was not. As Margaret read, a cold dread seeped through her chest. Her great-grandmother mentioned the oak tree behind the farmhouse, the same one where the family had gathered for the photograph. She wrote of seeing a child beneath it at dusk, a boy she did not recognize, dressed in worn clothing that didn't belong to any of her sons. She claimed he vanished the moment she called out to him, leaving only the rustling leaves and the feeling that he had been waiting for something she could not name. In another entry, she described how her youngest daughter began waking up crying, saying a strange boy had stood by her bed asking why no one saw him. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned each page. Her great-grandmother recorded how the other children began speaking of the same boy, describing him with eerie consistency, dark eyes, pale skin, clothing that seemed to sag off his frame. They said he didn't talk much. He mostly stared, silently, as though studying each of them. When Margaret's great-grandmother questioned the children further, they insisted he was sad, that he wanted something from them but never said what. She wrote that she felt both pity and terror because the descriptions matched the boy she had seen under the oak tree. The most disturbing entries came near the end of the journal. One described the day of the family photograph. She wrote that she had sensed the boy's presence that morning, lingering behind her as she prepared her children. She tried to ignore the prickling along her neck, telling herself it was only lack of sleep, only nerves, anything but the possibility that he was still there. Yet during the photograph, just as the flash went off, she thought she saw movement to her right, a small figure stepping forward from behind the oak tree. She prayed it was imagination. But the next day, when she examined the print, her blood ran cold. The boy was there. Standing among them. Staring directly at her. Yet when she showed the photograph to her husband, he insisted there was no such figure, that she was seeing shapes in the shadows. But she knew, deep down, that the camera had caught something she had been trying to deny. The last entries were fragmented, written hastily, as though her great-grandmother had been rushing to put her thoughts on paper before she lost the courage to continue. She wrote of whispers filling the house at night, sounding like a child softly crying. She wrote of the boy's figure appearing more clearly in her peripheral vision, no longer content to linger at the edge of the room. She wrote that she feared her family would think her mad, but she feared even more that something terrible had happened long before she married into the Whitlock name, something buried so deeply that even the elders refused to speak it. Then the entry stopped. The final page contained only one sentence, written in shaky, uneven script that suggested her hands had been trembling violently. "He wants to be remembered." When Margaret finished reading, she realized she was crying without knowing when the tears had started. She clutched the journal to her chest, feeling its age, its weight, its truth. The words inside it weren't the wild imaginings of a frightened woman, they were a warning. A confession. A plea for understanding that had gone ignored for more than a century. And now, with the restored photograph revealing the boy in chilling clarity, the family finally understood what her great-grandmother had feared. The child had never been gone. He had been waiting. Waiting for the moment someone would see him again, acknowledge him, allow him to step out of the silence in which he had been forced to linger for an entire lifetime and longer, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden behind torn pages or whispered stories or fading memories, waiting for the moment when the Whitlocks could no longer pretend they did not know him, waiting for the moment he could finally reclaim the place he had been denied in both the photograph and the family history that had tried so desperately to forget him.